Greetings, everyone. We're going to give it a few more minutes as people are logging in and letting them into the letting them into the main room. So we will get started momentarily. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So good afternoon and good morning, colleagues. Welcome to our webinar on redefining access, a conversation on inclusive accessibility. Our conversation today includes topics everyone should be thinking about. You don't need to work in disability or in accessibility services to do this work or provide support. Providing access is about developing a culture of care and the building of community. More importantly, it's about fostering a space where people, this includes students, staff, and faculty, feel comfortable asking for their accessibility needs to be met beyond approved accommodations. I'm Dr. Edwana Andrews. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I will serve as the moderator for today's discussion. I will now turn it over to our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves. We'll start with Renee Wells.
Hi, everybody. My name is Renee Wells, she, her pronouns. I currently serve as the Assistant Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at Queen's University of Charlotte, which is a small private liberal arts college in the Charlotte metro area. And by way of sort of contextualizing how I'm showing up in this conversation, the nature of my role means that I partner across the institution on all sorts of things, but also accessibility, and thinking about accessibility from sort of the 30,000-foot view. So how are we institutionalizing practices, policies that foreground access? So I work, for example, with search committees on thinking about how are we making sure that applicants' access needs are being met in the process? How are we unpacking the ways ableism might bias our reaction to candidates as part of the interview process? Similarly, I work with faculty on inclusive design for learning, but also the way ableist assumptions might shape our expectations for how students engage or learn in the classroom. I work with ITS on like thinking about web accessibility and making sure we're in compliance with guidelines. I work with departments across campus who are planning major events to think about folks' access needs. I work with supervisors on onboarding and like how are we making sure we're fostering an environment where we're inviting folks to name and work with us to make sure their access needs are met as they join our community. So, it runs the gamut. And so just for some context, some of the ways this shows up in my work, but I will pass back to Edwana to continue moderating.
Capria Berry.
Hi, everyone. My name is Capria Berry. I use they, them pronouns. Zooming in from Manhattan or Lenape-Hoking. I am currently the Associate Director for the MLK Scholars Program at New York University. This is a social justice oriented honors program for undergraduates. And part of my job includes being an instructor for a course that's sort of like social justice-y 101 kind of content. And then also have the opportunity to teach elsewhere, a more disability-focused course. And I am a PhD student focusing on the experiences of disabled queer college students of color. And previously have started sort of disability inclusion committees on different campuses, advised disabled student groups. Yeah, and so, and very involved with the Coalition for Disability and ACPA.
Awesome. Thank you, Capria. Erin.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you all. My name is Erin Mayo, she, her pronouns. I currently serve as the Assistant Director of Student Accessibility Services at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I'm currently growing neurodivergent student support on campus, trying to start a disability affinity group for faculty and staff by working with human resources. I'm the current chair of the Coalition for Disability, and I'm also serving on the ACPA 25 convention steering team as the accessibility advisor. So lots of ACPA things right now, which is exciting. And hopefully you'll join us in Long Beach in sunny California in February. And I also am an advocate with the National Center for Learning Disabilities, where we do advocacy work on the state and federal levels to increase equity for students with learning disabilities. So it's great to be with you all. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, panelists. And thank you so much for sharing about all that you do on your campuses, as well as your activities within ACPA and national organizations. And so looking at the work that you do on your campus and in national organizations, how do you define inclusive accessibility?
I'm happy to maybe get us started and then folks can hop in. So for me, it's really trying to implement universal design so that folks might not necessarily need to ask for accommodations. It's all of our responsibility to support students or faculty and staff, depending on our positions, with disabilities on campus. There's so many disabilities that are invisible. People come up to me and be like, "Oh, I had no idea that you had a learning disability," and that always invites for further conversation. And then really embracing that disability is part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation, and really trying to promote disability culture on campus, because it's really important to make sure that folks are accepted and that disability culture is celebrated on campus. So I will pass it over to the other panelists.
The first thing that comes to mind when thinking about inclusive accessibility is really thinking about accessibility from the beginning. I think so many times when in different settings talking about accessibility and like, okay, we just got an accommodations request for, in my case, usually an event. What do we do? And folks are like scrambling, trying to figure it out. And it's like, well, in our planning stages, what are we doing? What are we thinking about? What are we doing also to signal to people who we're inviting to this event that it is for them? And sometimes people, this phrase is often used like higher education wasn't built for, I'll use myself as an example. Higher education wasn't built for me. And then I'm like, well, higher education was built for people who are interested in learning, who are curious, who are creative, who are excited about learning new things and working on their skills. And so I'm like, and also today, how do we signal to people that they are welcome and belong and will be included and encouraged to participate in different spaces in whatever way makes sense for them in that moment?
And I will add, you know, for me, accessibility is all of the things that Erin and Capria said. One of the things that I stress a lot is that it's not just a process for how people's access needs get met, or even the outcome of their access needs being met. I think about inclusive accessibility from a community lens. Like a lot of my work is actually thinking about the environment of the campus and what is the lens that we are all sort of understanding the community we're a part of. So are we thinking about and are we recognizing dynamics of ableism as they show up around us? And are we able to recognize and respond and disrupt those? Are we able to Erin's point, proactively plan to prevent them? So I think a lot about, it's a filter. It's one of many filters we should always sort of be using to understand like the spaces that we're navigating. And so a lot of my job is helping people to kind of develop that filter and start to sort of recognize some things going on around them. And then the other layer I would add, sort of speaking to the research that Capria is doing is really recognizing ableism in an intersectional way and understanding that it is one of many systems and is reinforced and reinforces systems that have determined whose bodies we value and whose bodies we create space to ensure they're respected. And I'm very mindful that when I'm sitting with folks in our community, their experience of ableism is often exacerbated with other identities that they hold that are often also seen as less able or less respected. And so like for me, it's recognizing the intertwined and cumulative impact and helping people see that as part of the lens and the filter as we seek to understand ableism.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you, panelists. I like the approach that you take to defining inclusive accessibility, because accessibility is not just about checking a box, or at least it's not supposed to be. Some situations, people just want the box checked. But it's also, as you said, Renee, it's about an investment. Erin, you also talked about starting and thinking from the beginning. Capria, you also talked about starting and thinking from the beginning to be able to encourage people to participate. And so I want to ask you a question, Renee. If the goal is to foster inclusive accessibility, how do you approach your work with faculty and administrators?
It's a great question. To help, you know, I talked about the lens that I'm trying to sort of help people develop and hone. To help facilitate that, I use a lot of scenarios in my work to help folks recognize both the dynamics of ableism, like what's happening in this situation? What are, like I'll use scenarios with faculty that describe interactions between students and faculty, like related to accommodations. And I'll invite faculty to think about, how is the student experiencing this interaction, right? What is your sense of what a student needs? You know, how do you see the faculty member showing up? And part of it is to recognize how ableism plays out every day on our campuses, and to put a human face to it, to root it in connection and care. And so I use a lot of different kinds of scenarios to illustrate it, right? So, and stuff that's real, that's like come from conversations I've had in my work with folks. So, you know, like I had a colleague once who, you know, talked about how exhausting it was as someone who's hearing impaired to have to go every semester and say, I need to teach in one of these 3 rooms that has handheld microphones in it, in order for my access needs as an educator to be met, for me to be able to actually hear my students, and sort of unpacking how are we practicing accessibility when there's that much labor involved in getting your access needs met in this like unnecessarily iterative way. Or like conversations I've had where I've been sitting with search committees who have said things like, well, you know, that candidate wasn't very outgoing, you know, or personable. And so I'll invite folks to think about, what does that mean? And what job criteria is that connected to? And how might that privilege neurotypical people, right? So like sort of unpacking the things that bubble up and helping people recognize like what's operating underneath it. So I do a lot of that in order to help people perspective take and recognize dynamics that are going on all the time that they might not be attuned to.
Thank you. You, in your response, you talked about practicing accessibility. Are there ways we cause harm providing accessibility services to meet the needs of not only our students, but also staff and faculty?
Yeah, all the time. I would say some common ways I think that plays out for folks, you know, and whether we intend to or not, or even conscious of it or not, we often communicate distrust of disabled people just in the amount of evidence we require to justify like the work or the time or the energy that puts into meeting their access needs. Which is also connected to sometimes questioning the legitimacy of people's accommodations and or disability. Sometimes also communicating, sometimes overtly, but sometimes unconsciously, a sense of imposition, like it's a burden, like to have to do this thing to meet someone's access needs. And so I think there's a lot of ways we don't, are often too, like the communication that someone's getting an unfair advantage, I think is another common way that we cause harm. And I think, you know, a lot of the scenarios that I use invite folks to really sit with the way that's actually pretty dehumanizing when you stop and recognize what we're doing to folks, often without intending to, but the impact is there. And so how do we start to appreciate those dynamics? I say to folks all the time, we can meet people's access needs in really ableist ways. And we need to sort of recognize the relational dynamics of how we engage with folks around disability and around access, and ensure that we are fostering care, like that we are making people feel valued and welcomed, and that we're committed to meeting their needs in a way that's also affirming of who they are.
Thank you. Could you give us some examples of what everything that you just shared looks like in action? I know you gave a little snippet of an example in a search committee conversation, but what are some other examples?
Yeah. A lot of it, it's sort of a different version, I think of, you know, Erin talks a lot about sort of the inclusive design. I think about inclusive design also in a relational way. So for example, I do a lot of work with faculty about how do you invite students into a relationship of care around their access needs. Sometimes faculty think that the relationship, or they don't necessarily even think about it as a relationship, that the process starts when a student gives them their letter of accommodation, and then they do whatever steps they need to do to follow the process. You know, and one of the things I help faculty process is all the barriers that exist before a student even brings you that letter. The things that make a student unlikely to bring you that letter or uncomfortable bringing you that letter. And once you start to understand the dynamics of ableism, then how do you work to reduce those barriers, the relational barriers? And so I talk about what are ways that we can frame our syllabus statements that invite care, that invite relationship, that signal commitment to making sure that the space is accessible and that people's needs are met, and that it doesn't simply feel transactional, to your point about just checking the boxes, but that I care about you and I want this to be a space where you feel cared for. So let's have a conversation about what your access needs are, and recognizing that, you know, for accommodations, they're not one size fits all. And so how do we have a conversation with a student about what works for you and how do we work together? And so that's helping them see that as a relationship of support and care that helps all of the dynamics that get in the way for students, like anxiety, uncertainty about whether or not you can trust someone not to cause harm to you if you seek to get your needs met. So a lot of the inclusive design for relationship, I'll call it, is a big part of my work with both faculty and with supervisors too, thinking about how that plays out with folks who work in your team.
Thank you. Priya, these questions are for you. Renee talked about it's important for us to create learning environments, not just in the offices, but in the classrooms and other places. So could you share with us and define for us, because Renee mentioned it, about what universal design is? What is that?
Great question. Lots of different things. I think there's so many ways to answer this question, and some of it really depends on who you're talking to. So I'm going to give you some things to think about. Universal design in the like plainest terms, I'm thinking of ways to build an environment in any kind of context, virtual, in person, that eliminates as many barriers as possible for engagement of bodies and minds of all sorts. And also, there's a piece for me in this where I think of universal design, certainly universal design for learning in the classroom. And also, like, I work in student affairs, a student affairs-esque area that kind of has like one, piece in the academic world and another piece in the student services world. And I think this is relevant for both the teachings and like leadership trainings and things we host for students, and also that classroom space that I will say is very heavily facilitation based. And so all of that together, and I think sometimes universal design, like in my mind, is sort of like a movement. Everyone's not doing it. Okay. So I do think it's kind of like there, and like you started off this whole session with like, even if you don't work in disability services, like accessibility is your job. And all of the work I've done that is related specifically to disability and inclusion accessibility has been outside of my formal role. And so I think that's an important piece of like how I'm showing up to this conversation of like, it's not written in my job description, but it is written in my job description to serve students. So, we can read between the between the lines there of like, well, actually it is. And I also want to say there's I just went through a disability studies fellowship hosted by the Longmore Institute in San Francisco, and we talked a lot about disability justice. And so for me, universal design, I think, hits on a couple of different principles specifically. Renee mentioned intersectionality at the beginning of our chat. I think that is certainly important when we think about compounding oppressions. As Renee put it, that is important to how our community members show up to a space or an event, a class. I'm also thinking about, and I think it's so important in higher ed, the leadership of those most impacted. As a principle of disability justice, that needs to transfer into this work. And I always think about how are students included in the decisions that we are making. And so back to that syllabus point that Renee mentioned, like there's a statement in my syllabus this semester that says the burden of sharing, disclosing, securing accommodations is oftentimes, lying completely with the student. If there's something that I can do in this course that will support your learning, I invite you for that conversation. And I have to give a big shout out to my faculty at Colorado State, particularly pedagogical wizard, Dr. Alex Lang, because they've really outlined in our syllabi throughout my program, like the accommodations and accessibility conversation is an open one. It's an ongoing one. It can change when it needs to. So I try and extend that to my students as well. And my last piece on this is universal design for me, particularly thinking about in the classroom, relates to like, are there multiple ways that students can engage with the course? And so you show up to my course, actually you keep a journal. So I don't care how much you're raising your hand in class. That's actually not your participation piece of this. It's really, you keep a journal and you show me that you're engaging with the content in whatever way makes sense for you. Your journal can have pictures in it. It still has to have a write-up, okay? It can have links to videos, whatever sparks something in you that says like, oh, we talked about this in class, or we read this for class and it made me think of this thing, to show me that you're engaging with the content. So the other piece of universal design is like this emphasis on the learning, universal design for learning, and different access points and like modes of delivery, but also different modes that students can turn in or show their work, in air quotes here.
Yeah, thank you, Capria. You gave us some great examples of how you integrate universal design in your classroom and teaching. I was certainly taking notes and I'm going to implement some of those actions that you have. Can you share how you've been able to also implement universal design on your campus beyond just the classes that you teach?
Yes. I think that there's this component for me of like receiving student feedback. I sometimes find that it's not as easy or intuitive for students to know that they can provide feedback. Like that feedback goes in all directions. And I also think that's a cultural shift for many campuses to like let students know that, oh, if I'm unable to access this event due to any reason, like how do I relay that information and not just like turn around and go back home because I've encountered this event that now is not accessible to me and I feel really terrible about that. I'm just gonna leave. And it's like tricky, I think, because part of me is like, I really want students and colleagues and community visitors, whoever's coming to the function, okay, to feel like they can say when things need to be improved or when something didn't go well or when something was really hard for them to navigate. And at the same time, same breath, okay, it is not folks' responsibility to educate me on what I need to be doing. Like I have to do the reading, I have to keep up with the developments that are coming out from associations like AHEAD. I need to be in conversation with colleagues who are doing some of these practices. like the work is also on me. And I'm pulling back to my disability justice principles, but interdependence as one of them. Like it's everyone's responsibility to contribute to the accessibility of a space, of an initiative. Yeah, that's what comes to mind right at this moment, that like feedback is a part of it. And also I wanted to say too that like no one's going to get it right all the time. And I would be really lying to y'all if I said that everything I did was perfect and there were never any things that didn't go well, or times where I felt really bad that a student was like, I cannot access this space. I was really excited to come to this thing. And also knowing that I will not get it right all the time, and that expectation is not on me. But it is my responsibility and expectation of myself to do some research, to be prepared, to hopefully implement those universal design elements and components before someone asks for them.
Yes, thank you. So you gave the example of students showing up for an event and it's not accessible and they're like, what, I'm just done with this, I'm gonna go home. In what ways can we improve around universal design? What are some tangible ways that we can do things maybe without having a budget?
That's a great question. First thing that comes to mind is collaboration. Renee was talking about the identity piece, and that also makes me think of like identity-based support services, centers we have on campuses, different student orgs we may be partnering with. I don't know how the budgets are working where you are, but student orgs have a budget, okay? And I think, as much as we can be in collaboration with our campus partners, and those include student groups and academic departments, pulling those resources for a purpose that I think most people will agree is important, can be one of those options. There are lots of free resources out there, and so I'll go ahead and highlight the ACPA monograph from the Coalition for Disability that has some really important tips and suggestions that are sort of like tried and true from our very own colleagues in this association. And some of that does include like a checklist sort of thing. And sometimes you need a checklist, okay? So you don't forget things, so you're thinking of them from the beginning, so you can easily translate is not the exact word I want to use, but sometimes we have to justify why we're making decisions on events that have been done the same way for 100 years. Okay, so maybe that checklist in the ACPA monograph is important to use in that context if we're advocating for something that really has not been done on our campus before. And Aaron just put in the chat the monograph, and then also the podcast season that we have. Like, I know these documents and these websites just kind of live in a place away from like the actual people who've written them, but we are real people, okay? And the podcast is really kind of like, I like to think of it as a talk back of like, I actually wrote this in the monograph, and let me talk about what was going through my mind and like how this was kind of hard and took some trial and error, and how I navigated that in a really like tough spot where I knew that I had to do what was right, and that was to foster this inclusivity on my campus.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, Erin, for dropping the monograph and the podcast in the chat. And then there's Renee just also dropped a video of a webinar recording from a session she co-facilitated with another organization, NCORE. So please, everyone, get those links and save them for later because they're great resources. Erin, we've talked about creating and fostering equitable, flexible, and user-centered approaches, but we need to extend this conversation to discuss neurodiversity because It's not necessarily a new kid on the block, but it's new. It's new language to individuals. And so can you first define for us what is neurodiversity?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people get confused with like all these different terms that they all think are interchangeable. So really neurodiversity is like how our brains operate. Neurodiverse is a setting where they're both neurodivergent and neurotypical folks that are in the space. Neurodivergent are folks that identify such as, there's a long list, so I'm not going to list everything, but ADHD, autism, learning disabilities, and the list goes on. And neurodivergent is a setting where there are folks with differences. So 4 different words that all sound the same, but have not very different meanings, but different meanings. So typically it's neurodivergent individuals, or ND is the common like shorthand of it. So you might hear like, oh, folks that are ND, especially if folks are using it commonly, you might hear that as well.
Okay, thank you. Why is community important for those who identify as neurodivergent?
Yeah, so it's really helpful. I have a group from the nonprofit that I did advocacy work with. We have like a cohort of us that all identifies having learning disabilities. And it's really nice when you don't have to explain yourself on like why I'm processing slower, because the folks that are in that space with me just get it. We are starting an affinity group on the current campus I'm at to try to really connect students so that they have common experiences. So they can really discuss the challenges of how challenging it is to go into a really loud dining hall at 6 o'clock at night. Like, how can we work together to come up with solutions to improve the campus culture overall? But also really celebrate the wins, the successes of students and all that, but those that are neurodivergent. And that in addition, that although it's just really nice to like be able to relate to folks that have that common experience, whether they might not be working in the same field, but we all kind of experience similar challenges. And then also it's a really great way to like bounce ideas. Like, oh, I had this really challenging situation with a colleague of mine or a supervisor, like learning how other folks that are neurodivergent might approach it and have that conversation. It's just kind of nice when you don't have to explain yourself, which is why a community and more specific like neurodivergent support groups or programs at colleges and universities are starting up across the country.
Awesome, thank you. What are the practices that we as practitioners can put into place that are accessible for those who identify as neurodivergent? Going back to Capria, talking about budget, we don't have budget, but we are practitioners and it's all of our responsibility. So what are some practices that we can put into place maybe later on this afternoon or tomorrow?
Yeah. So I think it's really important for students to encourage them to self-advocate. I always tell students, I'm like, I don't know what's going on unless you give me some inkling of whatever's happening. So if you're having like a student leadership conference on campus, or hopefully ACPA 25 will actually have hopefully sensory rooms available for folks. So if it's like like a student leadership conference or an RA conference, try to have a sensory room and making sure that that is in a quiet location and has kind of fidgets and other like quiet noise and dim lights. So I think that is really great. I always encourage folks to like send performance evals to folks ahead of time. This is actually how I learned how to disclose in the workplace. But typically you would never walk into a meeting, kind of like a high stakes meeting, in my opinion, like a performance eval, and be expected to discuss a document that you haven't seen before. So sending the folks that you supervise performance evals 36, 48 hours ahead of time so that folks can read, process, and comprehend the information. For me, I have low processing speed and low working memory. So really having even 48 hours a day, like don't hand it to me, be like, we're going to talk about this and ask critical reasoning type questions right in that moment is challenging for me as somebody that identifies as having a learning disability. Also providing content warnings or content advisories for folks if you are bringing up specific things, really being mindful of people's past experiences. Communicate like schedule changes, send documents out prior. Really, if there is like a major schedule change, folks that are neurodivergent, and a lot of us, really like our structure, and that when things get changed, it can really impact a student or an individual, while also keeping in mind that folks might be neurodivergent, but they might also have another disability. They might be visually impaired, they might be hard of hearing, or another disability. So there's a lot of folks have comorbidities, so that you may not be aware of. In addition, it's really helpful to use plain language, so clear language that doesn't require abstract thinking. So instead of saying like, hang on, like really being clear, being like, please wait for me. So that folks that might have trouble interpreting abstract language really have that clear communication, clear and direct communication that might be helpful. They might not understand idioms or other kind of language that might be tough. So trying to send, in addition to like sending documents ahead of time, such as performance evals, my internet's unstable and I don't know why, so I apologize if I go in and out since I'm on campus. But
You're
if you
doing
have
great.
staff meeting agendas, okay, amazing. I'm glad it's not cutting out. Sending staff meeting agendas ahead of time for folks to really prepare for the conversation. At my previous institution, I tried to like read staff meeting agendas like as soon as they were posted. So if there were discussion questions, I could prepare, because getting called upon when you haven't thought about a question and you have low processing speed, or for me, I have also low working memory, can be really challenging. So I think that is important as well. Making sure documents are accessible, screen reader accessibility. Folks might want to listen to the document. There's plenty of free tools out there, such as Speechify and others that have Chrome extensions. So encouraging folks to use that. Typically when I start student meetings, I try to like provide, if it's not like an agenda meeting, try to provide a structure for the meeting. Okay, we're going to talk about X, Y, and Z, transition, and then like really kind of giving them this is what we're going to cover. Here's what the next half hour or 45 minutes is going to look like. Because often folks might be intimidated, they might not want to come to this conversation. So really trying to provide a structure to decrease their anxiety a little bit. Also providing questions that you might be asking them prior, like, hey, we're going to talk about this, be prepared to kind of answer these sorts of questions. When you're interviewing students or when you're interviewing folks, and people have talked about this a little bit, sending interview questions ahead of time. Interviews are really hard for folks that are neurodivergent because they might not pick up on social cues. And I think Renee and Capria both talked about this a little bit. But for like very like wordy questions that have 3 parts, that's really hard for a lot of folks, including those that are neurodivergent. So try to send it like, I understand that you might not want your interview questions to get like released. But really folks don't want to disclose for accommodations through the workplace. That is a whole other separate like webinar that we could go into. But try to send it to them ahead of time so that they can prepare. Like you aren't going to be walking into a meeting and be surprised with a question. But also putting it in the chat too is helpful for folks that are visual processors. I'm almost done. And then at the end of the meeting, really trying to summarize what you talked about in action steps is really helpful. And then I think just really remembering that the accessibility and the ADA is the ground, not the ceiling. So there is so much that we can do, like everybody else has talked about, and really just trying to collaborate with campus partners. But I know that was a lot.
No, that was good stuff, Aaron. We're, definitely adding information in the chat. And Capria, you want to share some things?
Thanks for that, Aaron. That was amazing. I do a similar thing with our meeting agendas. I love to add a meeting agenda to the calendar invite. Okay. I don't want anyone to be surprised when we all show up to the meeting and not know what we're talking about. I also have a deliverables section at the end. And people will know this about me. We're going to do a check-in at every meeting. Okay. Before we get down to the business. And I think that goes back to Renee's point of this culture, this community. Okay. So and just me as a practitioner, I'm not just interested in you in this transaction that we are doing. Like, I'm providing a service to you because I work here. And also your humanity is what I need to acknowledge first. All right. So I believe in a check-in, a check-in question at the top of the agenda. I wanted to highlight a few things. Another thing about meeting with students, we have sort of two ways we manage meeting with students. One of them is in this system where students can book a time with us. And there is a space for them. There's a space for us to put a prompt to say, if you would like to say a little bit about why you're coming to visit in more detail, feel free to add that to this box. And I love to put that box option there because I, as the disabled professional on the other end of this meeting, want to be prepared too. So I know we're talking about how to serve our communities, and it's also us too. What do we need to be able to do our jobs better and to show up for people fully? I wanted to say the thing about the meeting and agendas, we always, for our all team meetings, which include our student team and our professional staff, we designate a note taker for the meetings. And we choose that person a week in advance. And so we have a facilitator of the meeting. That person is different than the note taker. And so, you've got these different roles. So the facilitator is not concerned with, okay, I'm asking the questions, I'm receiving the information, and I'm taking notes. That sort of role is split. So we don't have questions about, or we don't have the stress of trying to do it all as one person. And so we select our note taker the week before we have that meeting. And at the end of the meeting, we just say, okay, next week's facilitator, who wants to take it? Who's the note taker? And so we can have our student team volunteer for those roles, including our GAs. I wanted to say too that training materials are really important. I have the honor to put together student leader training. And there's a piece where we talk about accessibility. Our students largely are the folks running our Instagram for our program. Okay, we should talk about web accessibility. We should talk about what colors might be best for access. We should talk about alt text. We should talk about plain language, and how the blurb for an event might differ from what's on the graphic and how they might align. And so I think that for a lot of folks, that stuff is new. Because it used to be that web accessibility pages only had information on how to design the web page and didn't really talk about social media. And now social media, at least for my work here, has become so important for how we engage students. And so having our team go through in training, because we kind of set the space up of while you're learning how to do your job and your responsibilities and how to log your hours, it is just as important for us to think about how we're providing access at many different touch points and no matter our role. Because going back to our first, 5 minutes of this, it's everyone's job. Okay, so I don't want to just say that it's only the practitioners, only the professional staff, our students too, because lots of times they're facilitating space for their peers. And so I always want them to be aware of how they're making that space accessible too. And I think it's really important on that peer-to-peer level to extend that inclusive, those inclusive practices on a peer-to-peer level. And I'm in a position where I have some responsibility here to make sure that my student team has the tools they need to have a good foundation to be able to work on those things and implementing accessible practices and universal design elements, even if those things are brand new to them. Whew. And the last thing I'd like to say, two things. One is when we do RSVPs for events, many times I've witnessed there's a box where one can disclose a need. And sometimes those are check boxes where there's just one option and you can't pick more than one. And then sometimes it's an open space, but it'll be phrased like disability, like singular. And I'm like, to me, it's all about the signaling. Okay, how are we signaling that we are inclusive and that we're open to whatever you have to tell us? And so just open-ended. I know on the back end, especially for really large events, it can be kind of time consuming to sift through that. And that is quite all right if it means that someone doesn't feel excluded. It's okay to take the extra 10 minutes to go through the results in the spreadsheet, okay? And then in conclusion, my fellowship this summer was for disabled folks who are scholar activists, who are really trying to work on that combination and take inspiration, in my case, inspiration from grassroots organizing in disability justice and use those principles and that framing within the academy. Okay, so I want to also differentiate being in academia is not grassroots organizing. Okay, different things. So I can get inspiration from organizers in disability justice, and being in an institution is not the same, but I can take the lessons learned. And we, in this fellowship, our cohort, we did access checks every day that we met. And so in your check-in, you're saying, hey, everyone, I'm answering the check-in question. And then I'm saying, my access needs are met. Or I'm saying, my access needs are not being met in this moment. The captions are a little behind today. Or it seems like the AI for auto captions is really not working. Or in a case that I raised in the summer, I was like, it's really helpful if when people are speaking, their cameras are not off or that they're not covering their mouths while they're talking. And so I think an access check is one idea to implement when you're in real time with folks and want to just kind of make sure that the door is open and that you've signaled that it's okay to let me know as a facilitator, like when things are not going well, even if I'm in the middle of a sentence.
Yeah. Thank you, Capria. Thank you. And for everyone putting in thoughts in the chat and ways that we can be inclusive, truly inclusive and accessible without having the budget to do so. And I just want to also share some tips for individuals. Look at your office. How accessible is your office? When I was having a conversation with Erin, she talked about the lights. Lights can be very triggering for individuals. And so is there an opportunity to maybe have the fluorescent lights off and to bring in your own lighting? Or is there opportunity to work with facilities to dim the lighting in your office? Your chairs, everyone's office has chairs for individuals to come and sit. Do your chairs have armrests? Do you have a chair with armrests and a chair that doesn't have armrests? So when you're thinking about universal design, is someone coming into your office to even sit? Is that accessible? I think about our police officers. I have a lot of conversations with them and they come in my office and they have all their gear on. And I finally was like, I got to get new chairs. And so I have chairs where they can pull up the armrest so they can sit comfortably and engage in conversation, as well as individuals of size. So thinking about the small things that we can do to make our own spaces accessible is critical, because again, this is everyone's responsibility. So panelists, I have one last question for you. And this is a good one. What happens when you meet resistance from colleagues or your institution in implementing these accessible practices?
I'm gonna just keep it short. Two things. One, I am known for sending a web page, a link, some suggestions, particularly when thinking about inclusive language, and how folks phrase language about disabilities. I am like, hey, and so my approach usually is following up in an email instead of the bringing it up in a meeting. I think that differs based on who I'm in the meeting with. If I have a rapport with this person that spans time, that feels a lot easier and differently, but more accessible to me to say in real time, hey, you said this, I would actually phrase it this way because this could be interpreted as offensive to XYZ community. And then the other piece, and so I hope they look at the webpage, okay, when I follow up with some good resources. And the other piece is I bring out the research, okay? I know part of that is because I'm in school and I'm like reading through things all of the time, but sometimes I do understand that to communicate across to my colleagues who are really interested in what scholarly research has been done in this area to sort of, unfortunately, like validate what it is I'm saying. I certainly do have references ready.
Thank you.
I would try to like either like research or like benchmark what your peer institutions are doing, being like, well, this school is doing it, like, why aren't we? Because then your institution will be like, oh, we want to be like them. So perhaps they're more likely to do that. But also communicating like what the professional associations are doing or how it ties back to standards or credentialing for expand upon that. Like, and then it will show like, oh, this is really important if they are being resistant, or do smaller things.
Oh no. I think we lost Aaron. Aaron, we lost you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Small things do go a long way. It just takes time. I think I don't know how much you lost me. I apologize.
That's
You
actually
picked it up
right
at
where
the
you
perfect part. Yes.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Low working memory is a challenge some days.
Yeah. So a lot of the work that I do across and sort of deep down within the institutional context is connected to restorative justice. And so a framework I almost am always using in conversations is like, how do people experience harm and how do we actively work to prevent harm? And I actually think it's important for folks to really process ableism and its impact as a form of structural and cultural and institutional and interpersonal harm, whether we're intending it to happen or not. And I also do a lot of bias response too. So I'm kind of often inviting people to sit with, like, it's really important to know how this can land, how this has landed, the impact and the harm that causes. And so the conversations I have with folks on the front end is how do we work to prevent harm in the spaces we share with students and with colleagues, and appeal to people's values. I'll often ask people to say, how do you want your students to experience classroom spaces? Or how do you want students and organizations to experience their relationships with others? Or how do you want folks you supervise to experience their relation, like in a way where they're defining their aspirational values for community? And then how does ableism prevent us from reaching our goals as a community? And what are the practices we can implement to prevent that harm from occurring? So it's kind of like an arc, but it's appealing to, because to Capria's point, some people want like the data and the research, and I'm also humanizing us and inviting us into care for each other.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Are there any questions from our attendees that anyone wants to ask? You can either drop it in the chat, raise your hand, unmute, ask the questions. Okay. Well, I'm going to continue to talk, but that doesn't mean you can't ask your question. So please use the chat, raise your hand, unmute, what have you. I want to make sure that we provide you with as much information as possible, an opportunity for you to ask questions or either share something that you're doing at your institution to ensure accessibility. We would love to hear that as well. Because you see the chat is full of all kinds of ideas that you can implement into your daily practice as a practitioner, as well as your institution too. And so I would like to just thank the panelists. So thank you all so very much for you giving your time. And also I acknowledge that this being a part of this webinar, the preparation for the webinar, you took this on as an extra layer of labor beyond your everyday responsibilities, your job descriptions. And so I do thank you for being a part of this conversation and for adding such value to the conversation around inclusive accessibility. And I'm so thankful that we had this conversation and we talked about it beyond just the students, because a lot of the conversations we have are strictly focused on making sure that the students have what they need and accommodations and stuff. But we talked about staff as well. We talked about faculty as well. We talked about the classroom and what are some things that we all can do as we are instructors, we are trainers, we are workshop facilitators. And so I'm grateful that we're able to have this robust conversation. It's also, I think, Capria, you touched on it a little bit. It's also important to make sure that we take care of ourselves while we are advocating and supporting our students, our colleagues, and our institutions. And so, yes, this is everyone's responsibility. But we also, again, we need to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, because we can't continue to advocate if we are not well. And so I would like to always put that out there. It's October. October is, Careers and Student Affairs Month, but October is also a very difficult month altogether in higher ed. And so just want to acknowledge and implore people to make sure that you're caring for yourself, and whatever that looks like, make sure you're doing it. And so with that, wanted to see if there are any final thoughts, suggestions, words of wisdom that our panelists would like to share before we log out. Nope, everyone's good?
Yeah.
Oh, there's Capria.
Just that I think the inclusive accessibility piece, as one person, I cannot move mountains. Okay. I can't change an institution overnight, no matter the size of the institution, but there are some things where I play a much larger role. And so the creation of that syllabus, for example, a lot of it rests with me. The creation of student leader training and what the topics are that show up on that agenda, I co-create that with my colleagues. And so I do have a significant portion of that responsibility to do some creating where we go in that training or those training days. And so I just want to say that I hope that folks don't get sort of like discouraged because we may exist in really large institutions, and it might feel easy to believe that whatever you do on a small scale doesn't make a difference. And I'm just going to remind you that it does, because and what I've learned too is that from the student perspective of things, but also with staff, because this like disability inclusion committee that I co-created at a former workplace started because colleagues disclosed amongst each other disability related identities, and then word spread just from sharing with a student that this group was coming together. And we started as a reading group. Okay, we were reading articles, hot topics in higher ed related to disability. And then it turned into much more of a community space. And that just spread by people chatting with one another, like small talk. And then eventually we got to email listservs to get the word out to students and colleagues. And so I would just say like that, the little pieces, the small things that you're doing each day will make a difference, because like it reaches one person, and I think like, yeah, it's worth it.
And I would sort of echo that and say so there's a moment, we all know this, right? We're at a place in time in higher ed where we often see students organically, because they've now been socialized to understand it as a way that they create accessible, inclusive space for each other. They'll invite folks if they would like to do so to share pronouns, right? And they've understood this is a way we signal a commitment to gender inclusion in the space. And so part of like when Capriya was talking earlier about their experience, you know, with the graduate program and like doing access checks, like what does it mean when we socialize that part of how we come together in community, like whether it's as a student organization, whether it's in RA team meetings, like whatever it might be, that we just say, hey, checking in, is there anything we can do to make sure everybody's access needs get met in this space? And that's not necessarily, because I mean, I think there's like sort of the checklist model of event planning that students go through, but this is the relational piece of it, where they start to understand this is how I signal an investment in this space, this communal space, feeling accessible and people feeling cared for. So I think it's like students really do latch onto and engage in those practices and continue them with each other without us prompting them, once they start to understand it, not just as a thing that they do on their checklist, but as a way that the people around them like feel connected with each other. And I think that framing helps, because so much of what I do is like helping connect back to the communal care piece of it. And so just naming that and helping to sort of naturalize that as part of how we're in community together for students and with each other as colleagues too. Just want to echo that.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending our discussion today, and we truly hope you gain insights and tangible ways that you can put inclusive accessibility practice into action with and without budget. So we definitely wanted to make sure that you gain resources. And again, there's tons of resources in the chat, so please make sure you grab those. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Have a great and fantastic afternoon.